This is a Guide Your Light network production, creating podcasts with purpose.
There is no greater value multiplier in the marketplace than becoming comfortable and confident with public speaking. Nothing is more valuable as an entrepreneur or as an employee than being great at communicating.
Welcome to the Things You Can't Unhear podcast. I'm your host, Maritza Barone. Get ready to hear moments that will help you to see the world differently and inspire you to become the happiest, healthiest, and kindest version of you. Are you ready to enhance the power of your voice? This topic today on this very special episode is one that I could speak to endlessly because I know how important it is to be able to share your voice in a way that is powerful and memorable and creates an impact. So if you've ever wanted to have more confidence in public speaking or learning how to keep an audience engaged, tune in to this whole entire episode from start to end. Whether public speaking scares the hell out of you or excites you, either way, this episode will bring you valuable takeaways that you can use immediately to become an unforgettable voice. Now, I invited world-renowned speaker Eric Edmeades to have this conversation with me. When I first heard him speak, it was on the Mind Valley platform, and I was personally working to enhance my speaking skills and break through some old lingering fears that I had that I think were holding me back. His tips have genuinely helped me in such a significant way that I can honestly now say that I no longer have any fear of being on stage or in front of an audience at all. And that's huge for me to say. And it's because I feel prepared, I feel equipped with the tools I need to engage people. It is something that can be taught, definitely. Now, Eric is a world-renowned speaker, as I said, with over 2 decades on global stages. He's also a very successful entrepreneur and expert in business and personal development. And he is celebrated for his absolutely dynamic, engaging, and practical approach to teaching the art of public speaking. You're going to love this. He's going to give you so much to take away and implement into your own life to create your own impact with your voice. If there's something in this that you feel will benefit someone else, please share it with them as well. And also rate and review the show if you can. Press pause now. Give us a little star rating on Apple or Spotify so that we can share this as widely as possible. Welcome, Eric Edmeades, to the Things You Can't Unhear podcast.
Glad to be here. Looking forward to hearing what we might say that we can't unhear.
Oh, there's going to be plenty. Now, when I first stumbled across your work, I was fascinated because no one had captured me ever in the way that you had captured me, the way that I was listening to you speak. And because I'm so passionate about the power of voice and helping people to find their voices, I knew that I had to speak to you and bring you on so that you could share with us and our audience what you do, because you create unstoppable humans through sharing their voice, don't you?
Well, yeah, I think that's a nice way to put it. I really do want to empower people to live a life of fulfillment, that they absolutely didn't stop themselves. And I think that's the first step in being unstoppable.
The funny thing is, probably both of us who now speak a lot for a living, both had huge fears around stepping in front of an audience. And for me, it was massive. I couldn't even speak to 2 people, let alone 100 people or 200 people or 1,000 people. And breaking through that was such a huge, I would call it freedom. It was freedom, and it was satisfying to me to know that, oh, wow, you can actually break through these huge fears, because what are the stats around the fears of public speaking? You would know them better than I do.
I think that the first thing to understand, at least in my estimation, is that nobody was born that way. Nobody was born afraid of public speaking. It's a fear that develops over time, and it develops because of, say, overbearing parents or misguided teachers, or just social pressures in general. and generally some combination of those things. And so that realization that it's not a natural fear, that most people were quite self-expressed until they weren't, that helps a great deal. And then another big part of it is that the level of compulsion you feel for your message, the level of passion you feel for what it is that you want to put in the world, really has a big impact. And this is a silly metaphor, but it's like if you and I are sitting if you and I, the old you and I, like afraid of speaking and whatever, and we're sitting in a restaurant and we see water seeping under the door from the kitchen, we might look at each other and go, look, there's water coming under the door, but we're not necessarily going to tell the people at the table next to us, maybe we will, maybe we won't. But if we see fire, in the window of the kitchen and the kitchen staff running out the back door, we're going to have no problem with public speaking in that moment and letting everybody know there's a fire. And so the level of passion you have for the message has a huge impact on overcoming your concerns, fears, nervousness, or whatever. And then the last bit, I think for now, is the level of preparation. If someone feels very confident about their presentation and what they're planning to say, and particularly how they're going to start it, everything changes.
Oh, there's so much in that. It's so true. I hadn't actually heard anyone say before that we were not born with this fear. We were not born with any fears, but you're so right in that environment has created that. And maybe identifying what that is probably a key to stepping beyond it as well. For me, yeah, when I did hear you for the first time, I was in hotel quarantine. We were sitting in a Sydney hotel, locked up in for 2 weeks, and I'd actually just been booked on a speaking gig. It was going to be an online one because it was the COVID world at the time. In front of the biggest crowd that I'd spoken to, and I was like, okay, I've already done a lot of work on this, but I'm going to be listening to you, and I think I listened to it 3 times over in a row. So there was so much in it, just like that paragraph that you just spat out. Then there was so much in that as well that we can break down. But you do say a lot that people are one talk away from whatever it is they want or they need or they're
Yeah.
trying to achieve. Can you explain that to our listeners today? Because I love that concept.
Yeah. The general concept is that at any given moment, you're one well-constructed, one well-delivered talk away from some significant breakthrough. And it depends on where you're starting from. For some people, that breakthrough might be a promotion, a pay rise, a new job opportunity. It might be raising money for a company. It might be getting a book deal, a movie deal, a Netflix deal. There's any number of things that can happen as a result of a well-delivered talk. And there are some great examples of this, and I'll get to them in a minute. But basically, I think what's going on is that the human brain evolved for storytelling, the vast majority of our education up until very recently was storytelling around the fire. That's where we got a lot of our life experience before we could go out and get that life experience. So our brains really like that. And then when you add to that the marriage of technology today, we're in a position where you could deliver a talk for even 30 or 40 people, but it could go online and it can go viral. Clips of it can go viral. The talk itself can go viral, and you have no idea what doors that'll open for you. TED has really demonstrated that. I mean, if you think about Brené Brown before she did her big TED talk, I mean, who was she before that? Well, I think her name was still Brené Brown, but she was just Brené Brown. After doing that TED talk and having it go so viral, that leads to a Netflix special, a couple of New York Times bestselling books, and a phenomenal speaking career. Simon Sinek, same thing. Great speaker, smart guy, but he does that one big TED talk, and all of a sudden it blows up for him. And it's not just about TED. I mean, in the political arena, I remember reading in Michelle Obama's book, she was talking about, I project my own experience on this a little bit, but have you ever had that thing where, at some point in your life, you find yourself checked into a hotel much nicer than anything you've ever had, or you get upgraded to business class and you feel a bit like an imposter? You feel like, geez, I'm in this gorgeous, they might catch me. Well, if you felt like that in a really nice hotel suite, imagine how Barack and Michelle Obama felt in the White House. Like that must have been quite an experience, right? And she talked about that and how out of place it was, fish out of water it was. But she also referred to the moment Barack's career shifted, where he was a state politician and he delivered this one talk, and that one talk propelled him onto the national stage. So when I say that people are one talk away, I mean, it's a literal thing. Very often you'll deliver this one talk. That talk might lead to the next booking or the next booking, or it might launch an entirely new phase of your life.
I love that. And bringing up Barack Obama, that's an example I use. He's an amazing speaker, and he brings in a concept that a lot of public speakers teach is the pause. He does the pause really well. And,
Yeah.
people who fear public speaking fear the pause more than anything, because you try to fill the space and the silence as much as possible because you're afraid of it. But
Yeah,
I do.
it's really crazy. There's a really good reason for that, by the way. And it has a little bit to do with relativity. This is a old school way of describing relativity, but I heard it retold about Einstein once, and he basically said that if you want to understand relativity or experience of time, then one way to think of it is that relativity is why sitting with your bare bum on a hot stove for 2 minutes feels like forever, when sitting on a park bench with a pretty girl for 2 hours feels like 2 minutes. And there is this like relative experience of time. And when a person stands on stage in front of an audience, and if they have any kind of empathy at all, then they are feeling their experience through the audience. And so if they leave a 1 second pause and there's, say, a bunch of people in the audience, they feel that 1 second pause through all those people, and it magnifies it. It feels like a minute to them. And the greatest speakers are the ones that can take that moment and let you hear what they said, or enjoy what they said, or laugh at what they said, and enjoy that experience.
Exactly. And as a speaker, it helps your brain catch up to what you're saying next. Giving
Yeah.
yourself that pause is so valuable, I found.
And it also helps with the breathing.
Exactly right. I do want to go through some of these tips. I think firstly it's important to note that let's flip people's mindset to go from fear to something else. So what's the first step, would you say, like, to remove that fear element and have the courage to go, okay, I'm going to give this a go?
Well, okay, I want to step back to something. Earlier I said you're not born with that fear, and I think you said like we're not born afraid of anything. And I would offer a little correction to that. I think there are some things that we have an instinctual fear to, like we have a natural fear of falling, and we have a natural fear of loud noises. And I would argue that there are some instinctual fears, like if somebody has a fear of snakes, there's a rational connection that we are the survivors of people who were killed by snakes, so that and spiders and that sort of thing. And I think that inside the fear of public speaking, there is one of those sort of almost their instinctual fears, and that's the fear of ostracization. It's the fear that I might say something that gets me excluded from society, because that's how it used to be. I mean, this is maybe a clumsy way to put it, but there's a whole lot of chatter on the internet and on socials and this about narcissism at the moment. And one of the reasons that we're dealing with this is that if you lived in a small hunter-gatherer tribe and there was a narcissist, that wouldn't last very long. Like that person would burn a bunch of their friendships. They'd be kicked out. They'd be ostracized, and they'd be out, and then they'd have to go live in the wilderness on their own, and that would be very dangerous for them. And so narcissists didn't do very well in that type of environment. They only do well once the population starts to grow and they can burn through friends groups. They can burn a few people, but just get some new people. And conversely, we now have this exaggerated sense of if I say something, then I'm going to get canceled and that sort of stuff. And we have to be aware of that. So I think anybody contemplating, hey, why am I nervous about public speaking? I think they should look at what it is they actually think they're afraid of. Most people aren't actually afraid at all. What they are is nervous. And I would suggest that nervous is the same emotional response as excitement. It's the same emotional state. There's only one real difference. Like, I think one of the ways I usually put this is that if I told you that off camera here, a friend of mine was very angry, you would be able to describe their physiology, how they were holding themselves, were they tight, what did their eyes look like? If I told you, conversely, on this side, I have somebody who's like sad and depressed, you'd be able to describe for me what they look like, what their posture looks like. Well, we know what depressed looks like. But nervous and excited, they're basically the same. Sweaty palms, feeling in the belly, they're very similar. There's only one really distinct difference between them, and that is your expectation or your expected outcome. So if you have somebody who's nervous about something amazing that's about to happen, then I would argue that that person's excited. On the other hand, if you have somebody who's excited about something terrible that's going to happen, I would say that that person's nervous. And so for many people, that reframe itself is very helpful because they begin to realize, oh, I have these butterflies in my stomach and I have sweaty palms, but they were taught that that's a fear. And I go, no, and by the way, many people instinctually know this because you say to them, well, I mean, how would you feel if you weren't nervous at all? And they may go, well, then I'd be worried because I think it's the nervousness that gives me the energy to be good. No, it's not the nervousness, it's the excitement. And so I think that's a big part of it, is recognizing that we are miscommunicating the difference between nervousness and excitement, and we can change that by visualizing and imagining the thing going better, and then weirdly we shift to an excited frame of mind, much more powerful.
It's such an amazing mindset flip, and that can be taken into our lives in so many ways. I've heard you say that before, and my 10-year-old niece was panicking about going to school camp, and I said to her, "How are you feeling?" "Very nervous." And I'm like, "Do you know that nerves are the same feeling as excitement?" So it was really helpful to her in that situation as well. I think we can really take it to our lives.
So another component of the nervousness factor is that in school, we are taught a very powerful but subliminal message. And that message is that if you make things look a little harder than they really are, you might get a little more brownie points, right? So if you imagine two kids, one kid getting ready to speak for the General Assembly, the parents, the siblings and the teachers and what have you, and that kid is smooth, nails the presentation, the slides work, the props work, just really rocks it, and it's like perfect. That kid's going to get a great applause, no question about it. Second kid comes up, and that kid, cheeks are flushed with blushing, the eyes are teared a little, the kid's stuttering and stammering, really struggling his way through, but he keeps powering on and he keeps powering on and he gets through it. That kid, I would put to you, is going to get a bigger applause, and that kid's going to get more hugs, and that kid's going to get more accolades. And the first kid is going to see that, and so are all the other kids going to see that, and they're going to pick up a subliminal message. And that subliminal message is, if I make things look too easy, I will get less benefit. I'll get less reward. If I make things look a little harder, I'll get more. And so now somebody gets asked to do a presentation and they realize, well, if I look too confident, I might not get so much. So I'm going to dumb it down a little. And what starts off as an act to get a little bit more praise soon starts to feel real. And so then people start getting nervous. And then this is where the feedback loop gets really terrible, is now you go on stage and you show your physical nerves. You might even admit that you're nervous. Now, when you get feedback from people, you know that feedback is insincere. You know that because you know that you were acting afraid or acting nervous. And so all these people go, oh my God, that talk was just, oh, Maritza, that talk was so, wonderful. And you're like, in your head, you're going, well, bullshit. You're just saying that because I look so nervous. And so then that person becomes increasingly nervous because they can't believe any of the feedback they get. And so one of the biggest upgrades anybody could have is, even if they're feeling nervous, is not to admit it, not to demonstrate it, not to show it to anybody, and accept that they might not get as much positive feedback, but the feedback they will get will be genuine.
That is a very interesting concept. I hadn't actually thought of that either. I love how you bring these thoughts into my mind when it comes around this. We have a lot of people have probably already noticed there's stories filtered into eh, this 20 minutes of conversation, a lot of stories. And when I heard you first talk about the impact that you can have early on in the piece to engage everyone, storytelling is a huge part of that. Can you tell us why? Why is storytelling so important?
So there are layers of answers here, and one of them is that the way the human memory works is that it is directly tied to emotional response. One way to think of it is, and this is an important distinction, is that life was never so easy before. The average person today will face death once on the day they die. If you go back 3 generations, you have the reality of facing death on a pretty much annual basis. If you go back another 3 generations, it was monthly. Another 3 generations, it was weekly. And it's not long ago that people were facing death on a day-by-day basis. Life was difficult. And this is important because what that means is that if something happened in your life and it created a really positive emotional response, it was probably worth remembering, right? Like, if you found a tree full of ripe fruit, in the fall, and you got to eat all that beautiful, healthy fruit sugar, preparing you for the winter, and you produced all this serotonin, dopamine, which is emotions, then that's going to help you remember where that tree was, right? And conversely, if you had a really horrible experience, frightening or angry, but you survived it, you want to remember what you did to survive it. And so emotion is the glue that causes a memory to stick. So in the reality of communication, it's much more difficult to elicit emotional response in a lecture than it is in a story. Stories naturally, as long as they're well told, naturally lead to emotional response. And then another layer of it is that not only are emotions the glue that cause a memory to stay, emotions are also the key that cause a memory to release. And this is why you can talk to people like, oh, I don't really know any stories, or I don't really know any jokes. But as soon as other people start telling stories, they go, oh yeah, that reminds me. And what's happened is that an emotional response has been, triggered in them, and that emotional response is then triggering their memory, and that's why their stories come forward. So stories are fundamental to our capacity for remembering and recalling things. And I think the reason they're like that is that, look, before we had the distraction of internet, we had TV, and families used to sit around and watch the TV. Can you imagine? Families used to sit around and watch all the same show on the same night together.
Mm-hmm.
And then before that, there was the radio, and no kidding, families sat around and listened. Can you imagine bringing your teenagers together now and go, hey kids, let's sit around and listen to the radio together. But that's what they did. But even that is incredibly recent compared to the much longer history of sitting around the fire. Sitting around the fire is something that's happened for, hundreds of thousands of years. And what happened around the fire? Well, once we had fire for the first time, we actually had some level of peace and calm. Like the big predators weren't coming around. We felt safe. We were warmed at night. We could cook our food. Like fires changed everything. And they probably stimulated the beginning of really powerful storytelling. And I would suggest that let's imagine that you're a young, let's imagine we have a young hunter that's going to be a hunter. But the thing is, it's not safe for that hunter at 6 or 7 or 8 years old to join the hunt. It's not safe yet. But we want that hunter to know some things before the kid's big enough to go on the hunt. Well, where's the kid going to learn that? By hearing stories being told around the fire. So this, I would argue that stories are really the programming language of the human condition, or the human brain. And it's been that way for so very long that today Hollywood's willing to spend $200 or $300 or $400 million creating a story to entertain you for 2 hours, because they know that story is one of the most satisfying experiences we can have.
And the thing with storytelling too, and a lot of people don't like to share their own stories, or don't think they're worthy enough, their stories are worthy enough to be shared. They don't actually have to be your stories. You have said plenty of little stories throughout this conversation already that aren't exactly your experiences, but stories that we can still follow along with, like the kids at school. And for example, that you've shared, like the people sitting around the fire, it still creates a visual in my head as a listener and allows me
Yeah.
to connect emotionally with what you're saying, regardless of whether it's your story or if you're recounting it.
Yeah, very true. I think that this raises two very good points. The one is exactly that you don't have to be telling your story. That said, you shouldn't misrepresent somebody else's story as your own. I think that doesn't need to be said, but maybe
Absolutely.
sometimes it should be said just
Mhm.
as a reminder. But then the other side of it is that a lot of times people aren't comfortable sharing their own story because they don't see the value in their story. And this is a very strange opposite of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, because in this case, um, it's the beholder that degrades the value of the story. In other words, somebody, let's say, got fired from their job, and it was devastating for them, and they had to go through this whole emotional thing, and then they had to realize why they got fired, and that forced them to grow, and then they went to a new interview, and then they got an even better job, and their life was vastly improved, and now the whole thing's done for them, and they're like, well, I don't think my story of being fired is very valuable. But that's because you've already been through it and you've already had the benefit from it. But to the person who's about to get fired, your story might be priceless. Or for the person who just got fired, your story might be priceless. But for you, because you've already lived the whole experience, the individual person might look at their story and go, I don't see the value. We refer to this as the metaphorical Rembrandts in the attic. Like, you've got these paintings sitting up in the attic of the house, and you've walked past them so many times that you've lost sense of how valuable they might be to somebody else. But for the right person, the right audience, the right circumstance, that story might be worth $10,000, $100,000, $1 million. It could be a very valuable story for somebody else.
That's true. That's really true. I think a lot of fear for me was also forgetting what I might say. And I think that stories really helped me to, because if I have in my head 3 stories that I'm going to be sharing in that talk, I won't forget those 3 stories because number one, I've
Yeah,
experienced, I've got an emotional connection to them, and I'm excited to share them. So that's a really great tool for those people who I think are fearful that they may forget things. Are there any other tools that you use to keep your mind on track to remember exactly what you wanted to
absolutely.
share?
I mean, here's rule number one: never, ever, ever write your speeches. Like, you just never do that. Now, of course, never say never. I will provide a couple caveats or exceptions. If you are delivering a politically sensitive speech or a legally sensitive speech, and you're being advised by lawyers, then okay, you might have to follow a script. I get that. But in almost no other circumstance should somebody write out their speech or speak from a teleprompter. I, I'm going to say there's a bunch of reasons for this. The one is that if you write out the speech and attempt to memorize the written speech, then what you're going to do is invoke a kind of wrong kind of memory, a chain memory. You're going to try and remember each sentence to trigger the next sentence. And so if you lose one sentence, you lose the whole talk. It's a terrible strain on your memory. It's not a functional way to do it. The other reason is that people don't tend to speak in the same grammatical structure as they write. So if you write out your speech and then you try to speak it, well, it won't sound natural. I think Harrison Ford was famous for telling George Lucas on the set of Star Wars, George, you can write this shit, but you can't say it. There's a difference between written dialogue and spoken dialogue, and that's a very important distinction. So I think that and even, by the way, this applies if people are speaking from like teleprompters. I mean, okay, so you don't have to remember it, but it's still not normal speech patterns. It's still not, the way people normally speak. I would put to you that a major influence in electoral outcomes, as we've just seen in America, a major influence of that has to do with the level of authentic delivery of the candidate. Now, I'm not talking about the quality of the candidate as a human being or their value. I'm talking about the level of authenticity with which they deliver. So here's what I would say is if we look at, say, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump said unconscionable, horrible things, and you'd be like, why would anybody? But here's part of the problem is you would hear people go, well, I don't like everything he says, but I like that I don't have to guess what he's thinking. Like he's just authentically being himself. Whereas Hillary Clinton, she may well have said the very thing that you wanted her to say, but you didn't know if she meant to say that or if it was given to her by teleprompter. And so I would argue that inauthenticity is ultimately what lost her that election. I mean, we could argue about electoral college vote structure and what have you, but I still think that's going to be the biggest influence. And I would say that the same thing is true this time around, is that when Kamala was speaking very often, she was very routinely following a tight script given to her by the DNC, the Democratic Party. She's reading from a teleprompter, and Donald is going, just following his heart. Now, we can debate the value of his heart and his value system, but humans have a very, very powerful instinct to be drawn to authenticity. And the instinct is so strong that I would be willing to bet that you would rather spend an hour with an authentic enemy than an inauthentic friend. And because an inauthentic friend is really dangerous, where an authentic enemy is not so dangerous because you know what's going on with them. And I think that's another really important reason for not writing out and trying to memorize your scripts. If you, as you put it, if you know that your story or that your talk is comprised of, say, 3 primary stories, you really only need to remember 3 things and how you plan to get from one to the other. And that's simple. Whereas if you try to memorize the 30 minutes of speaking you're about to do and memorize all the words, very, very different thing. I don't know if you've ever seen, I sometimes talk about using what we call speech maps, which is like a mind map of your speech. And that's a great way to remember talks, because it's like, you have the topic in the center, you have the stories around the outside that you're planning to tell, you follow it clockwise. It gives you a sense of time. Also, if you use imagery on the map, it's really easy to remember where you're going and remember where you are. Plus, as I say, if you let's say you're going to be speaking for an hour and you're at the very bottom of the map, you know you're about halfway. And so it creates a sense of time connection with your talk. Speech maps are a phenomenal way to design speeches.
Yeah, agreed. Is that what you use at the moment, or do you feel like you're at
Always.
a point where you don't need that anymore and you can just
All right, to be fair, I shouldn't say always. Always for something new. There are times where I'm fully organic. There's no question. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've often, one of my very first business talks actually is a good example. I was in London, England, and I was invited to do a talk, and I didn't realize I was there to do a talk on business. I thought I was there to talk about health and nutrition because that was my major hobby at the time, long before Wild Fit and that stuff. And when I got there, the organizer asked me about my talk. And when I explained that I was, that I was going to be speaking about health, he's like, whoa, 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 that's not what you're here for. You sold your tech company and you're here to talk about that. I'm thinking, hell, I sold it so I didn't have to talk about it anymore. But I had about 15 minutes to prepare. Clearly, I don't have time to design a big talk, and I just had to speak organically. And luckily, at this stage of my life, I can do that, but I don't think it's a good habit. I think it's much better to be more prepared, create a good speech map. So you've got you kind of. I'd rather have a speech map that I modified and customized on the fly than have nothing.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think definitely I've heard this quote a lot is magic happens when preparation meets opportunity. And I think
Yeah,
you've said it in a few of your podcasts as well. It's being prepared, but not over prepared, over scripted, over planned. It's just
yeah,
having all of the elements there ready. So when the curveballs are thrown, you can create the magic whenever it's needed. And
absolutely.
that comes with time and experience. Knowing your audience is something that I want to talk about as well, because I think that's a big thing in shifting the way that we actually communicate. Because you could be talking to a group of teenagers at a school or a group of business people, and the way that you articulate yourself is obviously going to be very different. What have you got to say about that side of things when we're trying to like hone in on the emotion that we're trying to invoke from the people that are listening?
I think there are two very important metrics to consider with any audience, and the one is let's say their energy. What's the energy level like in the room? And the other one is their, let's say, content velocity. That is to say, where are they relative to the content that you're going to be speaking about? And I think it's very important to know those two things, because if you start your presentation in a serious mismatch of either their energy or their content frequency, you're going to break rapport with the audience and you're going to cause some problems. So let me make that more tangible. Years and years ago, I was doing, I think, my second ever event with Tony Robbins. And when I toured with Tony, and I was very lucky to do that, and he was unbelievably good to me, and just such a great friend and a mentor. But one thing that I've always been proud of is that at every event I went at, they always made me follow him, and that's following Tony Robbins is quite an experience. And the second event that I was going to do that, a friend of mine came to me and he goes, look, Eric, you're really gifted on stage. There's no question you're a great storyteller, but the trouble is that you start soft, and that works in 90% of cases, but it doesn't work if you're going on stage right after Tony, because Tony has worked everybody up to level 1000, like their energy is super high. So if you come on in a more kinesthetic or softer tone, they won't even hear you. They won't even, they won't even hear you. And so that might've been the first time where I really got this sense of it's very important to meet the audience energetically where they are. After that, you can pace them and you can take them to different places, but you kind of have to meet them where they are. Then another thing is that you as I say, the content frequency, like where are they relative to the content that you're going to speak about? I'll give you a great example. I often I do very deep dive meditations in our retreats. I'm a big fan of meditation. I speak about meditation. I've been meditating since I was 12. And so I'm a fan. But if I'm speaking at like kind of a corporate event, I'm not going to walk out immediately and go, all right, everybody, close your eyes and take a deep breath, right? Like I'm not going to start at say 70 kilometers an hour on meditation. What I might do is talk to them about the power of visualization, and then I might move from that to the next thing and the next thing. And I'll tell you, I recently did a corporate gig for a major publicly traded, like big corporate company, and I hadn't done one in a long time. And I got there and I was going to be on stage for about 2 hours. And I knew that by the time I got to about 90 minutes, I wanted to have lifted them to that level where I could talk to them about meditation. Well, I started off at their content velocity, and then I used stories to build it up and got them to the point. And I said, and by the way, I don't know if any of you guys are into meditation, but I've earned the right at that point. I've warmed the room. So I think that understanding those two axes or those two measurements is unbelievably important. One of the best ways to do it is when you're speaking at a multi-speaker event, be in the room. Like, I'm amazed that these speakers are like, oh, I only need to be there for my slot. I really try to be in the room at minimum for the speaker that's on directly before me, and maximally through the event, because I will understand then the event culture a lot better.
That is a brilliant, brilliant tip, actually. I want you to share with us maybe 5 of your top engagement tips for public speaking. So we've talked about a few of them already, but I'd love you to just give us some quick fire, amazing public speaking tips.
So one has to do with humor. And I don't consider myself a particularly funny person. I'm not a comedian. And people often come to me after my talks and go, "Oh my God, I laughed the whole time. Are you a comedian? Do you do comedy?" And what I want to suggest is that what I've discovered about that is that humor obviously generally requires a degree of risk taking. And so that's why many people won't even try, because it's risky to try to be funny. So one of the ways to overcome that is to start your talk with something that's clinically funny, like, having a gag or a story or a joke that works. Like, so for example, one of the very first times I did an event with Tony Robbins, there was kind of a funny thing that happened, but there was a mess up with the translation, and the script was done in Chinese for the event, but then he decided that he wanted to introduce me himself, and where he should have said, well, like, Eric's not really a speaker, he's an entrepreneur, and we're really lucky to have him. He started his first business and he sold it 9 years later. Instead, Tony comes out and he goes, "I'm so excited to have this next speaker. He started his first business when he was only 9 years old." And it was just a mess up of translation. But when I tell the whole story, it's funny, and I do the Tony impersonation, and it cracks people up at the right event. So knowing the gag, the cute story, the funny joke that you have relative to match with the audience, if you start with that right away, you break the ice with them. You see that they have a sense of humor. You become less risk averse, which means you'll be funnier, and they have been primed for that to happen. Putting an icebreaker in at the beginning is one of the very best engagement tips I could offer. Another great engagement tip, contextually, depending on the type of event you're at, is asking questions. And I really like asking questions that at some point everyone in the room will have to acknowledge. We'll have to answer, like, how many of you flew here to be here, and how many of you didn't fly here to be here? You've kind of put yourself in a situation where everybody needs to engage. And I think a really key part of that is that if you are going to ask questions, you must insist on an answer. This is the establishment of what we'll call command authority. It's like, if you don't get an answer from the first question, then that's it. They're going to treat you like you're a television from then on. You don't want that. You want them to be paying attention to your instructions. So if you go, "How many of you flew here today?" Leave your hand up until they raise their hand, and they thank you to them once they do. And then the same with the people who didn't fly there. So that question answer thing is really important to establishing that connection.
And if no one does raise their hand?
Then I would make a joke about that. I would be like, "So nobody flew here? Not any of you? Or are your arms tired from flying here?" And which is super funny, because everybody knows not to use that joke, but in that context you could, right? So I would poke fun at it. I think, you can do a kind of a masterclass on how do you get audiences to respond, but I can tell you a big part of it is you just wait until they do. "How many of you flew here today?" "Oh, you? Oh, you?" And you acknowledge and say thank you. And then people begin to realize it's okay to engage, right? So I think that's really valuable.
That is.
Another great engagement tip is acknowledging them. Now, I am not in the school of thought that you should thank the audience. I don't like that when speakers, "Oh, thank you guys for being here." No, you should be thanking me. Now, that might sound a little arrogant, but I believe that my goal is to deliver so much value that you will thank me for being here. And I'll say there's an exception to this. If it's your event and they bought a ticket from you, and then I think you can thank them for being there, no problem. But if you're like a corporate, you're going out and speaking at a corporate event, and you go, thank you for being here. Well, it wasn't their choice. So it's a little disingenuous to thank them, right? Like, so I'm not a big fan of that. But what I am great or a very big fan of is acknowledging them. And so, and I like to do that in any number of ways, sometimes playfully. So if I'm at a corporate gig, I'll often do something along these lines. Hey, I just want to acknowledge that I know that some of you have probably been looking forward to this session. You read the schedule, and you're looking forward to it. Some of you maybe know me from YouTube. I'm really glad to have you here. I know some of you are a little cautious. You're sitting here going, I don't know about this guy. You're wondering if it's going to be any good. And I know that some of you are sitting on aisle seats and back row seats because you're still thinking you're going to leave. You're thinking if this doesn't go great, you're going to be out of here. And by the time I've done that, all the people that are sitting on the aisles and sitting in the back row, they're laughing their asses off. And I've acknowledged every psychology that's in the room. So, that acknowledgement of them can be done in a variety of different ways, but there is something about letting them know that you see them. And then I think that was 4, and I'll give a 5th one. And this is a beautiful quirk of the English language. It does not work in every language, but in English it does. And that is, do not refer to them as a group of people, refer to them as an individual person. And so I would say something along the lines of, I'm really glad that you are here. You. And that's the quirk of English, is that you works in both singular and multiple. So you can't do that in French as easily. It's a beautiful thing that we can do in English. And I like it a lot because the minute you start going, and you people, or, the audience today, you're reminding them that they're an audience, that they're sitting in a chair, that their bladder might be full. Like the way I often put this, my belief is that when you walk on the stage, your job is to create a bubble and to keep them in that experiential bubble. So they forget they're at a conference, they're with you. If you're telling a story, they're in the story. They smell it, they taste it, they feel it. So much so that they might bump into you 3 years later and they still remember the story. And so if you talk to them like they're an audience, you're less likely to engage that level of emotional response.
And that's a great tip for anyone who has a podcast as well, is to address one listener on your podcast rather than the group of listeners. I love that. I love all of that. This is so fascinating. I want you to leave us with one piece of advice for someone listening today who has held back from sharing their voice, and what you would say to them. I had someone call me a couple of days ago. It was, I won't say who it is or what her background is, but let's say she's a hairdresser. So she's a very experienced hairdresser with a lot of years under her belt and has become a bit of an expert in her field, has been invited time and time again to speak on different panels about her craft, but she's held back because of numerous reasons, and mainly it's holding herself back and being afraid to go out there. What's your word of advice to someone in that position listening right now, this one person listening right now? What would you say to them?
I really hope that you are listening right now. And I would say, first, I'm going to say something a little bit glib. I'm going to say, get over it. I'm just going to say, get over it. And then I'm going to give you some information. There is no greater value multiplier in the marketplace than becoming comfortable and confident with public speaking. Nothing is more valuable as an entrepreneur or as an employee than being great at communicating. Nothing. Here's a crazy thing. Study was done a while ago measuring the impact of height on income. And it turns out that in corporate America, if you are like an inch taller, then you actually make slightly more money on the statistical average. It's apparently there's something about being a little taller. You're more likely to get promotions. And so on. I'm not saying it. I mean, I'm not particularly tall. So I don't particularly like this statistic. It just is the way it is. Now, you don't have any influence over that. I mean, you could wear bigger heels. You could sort of artificially lift stuff up, but what you're talking about is a nominal increase of income per centimeter taller or per inch taller than you are, nominal. Whereas becoming comfortable and competent with public speaking is a 10x multiplier on income. And I'll give you a tangible example of this. Let's imagine that somebody is a hairdresser and they're charging, whatever it is, say $30 to do a haircut. I don't even, depending on what market they're in and what have you. Now, let's say they are invited to speak at a say conference. They're invited to speak at a style conference, or they're invited to speak at a business conference, and they're talking about personal branding or whatever the case might be. When they then say, by the way, let's say they talk about personal branding. They go, let's talk about personal branding. This is what has to happen. And I can tell you that, like, when you start letting those little neck hairs grow in, and for men, you've got the shortcut and the neck hairs start growing in, it shows that you haven't had a haircut in about 2 or 3 weeks. And what that unconsciously communicates to people is that details don't really matter that much to you. And so, you leave some great thoughts and information. Now, at the end of that, people are coming back and go, I want that person to cut my hair. Only they can now charge $300. They are an expert. They've painted themselves as an expert. Now, I'm using the hairdresser as a bit of a flippant example, but let's talk about the business consultant. The business consultant goes to a networking event, meets some business owners, makes a bit of an impression, tries to make an impression, meeting each one, exchanging business cards. Another business consultant accepts a speaking gig at the same event, goes on stage for an hour, makes people laugh, makes people think, teaches really valuable stuff, and invokes something we call the stage effect. You have all these eyeballs on you, and that makes you more attractive to the marketplace. Now people are coming up to you and saying, hey, I'm interested in a business consultant. Well, now you've got many more leads to deal with, which means you can say no, and by raising your price. You can so I walked off the stage in Las Vegas, Nevada many years ago. I was on stage for 2,000 or 3,000 people at a Tony Robbins event. And these guys came up to me and go, we'd like to buy you lunch. And I know there's no such thing as a free lunch, but I was hungry. So I went for it. And I'm sitting having lunch with these two guys. And they start telling me about their internet business, and they're running an incredible internet business. They have 100 million web visitors a year, and they're American web visitors. So it's like, like high quality traffic. They're making 10 million a year already, and they want me to come and help them. And I realize I don't want to do that. They then start trying to offer me a job, and I'm like, I don't want a job. I'm not looking for a job. They want me to move to California. I don't want to move to California. So I'm like, I'm cornered. And I don't really want to say no. So what did I do at that point is I say, oh yeah, I'll tell you what. Yeah, I could do that. It would be $20,000 a week. Now, this is 20 years ago. So, even then, like I mean, it was a lot more than what we think of as 20,000 a week now, right? And I expect that what they're going to do is go, oh, thank you very much. We didn't realize that you were so expensive. Their answer was, can we get 6 months? I said, can we get you 1 week a month for 6 months? I'm like, oh, hold on. Because I'm like, this is not what I had in mind. I'm like, hold on. I fly on Fridays. So it's only 3 days. It's 20 grand for 3 days. They go, okay. And I did 6 months of consulting for them, and great results for them. And it really showed me that before I was a speaker, I could never have commanded that level. So I would say that anybody who's feeling held back, it is absolutely imperative that and by the way, one more thing. This is so important. We've all been to conferences. There's no question. We've all been to conferences. This is fascinating. I want you to think about this. Have you been to a conference where at least half of the speakers were mind-numbingly boring? Mm-hmm. We have. They were paid to be there. Some of them were flown there in business class. Somebody paid for their hotel. They're being treated like a VIP, and they were bad, which means the playing field is not level. It is so easy to differentiate. And so it's so worth doing.
Definitely. I'm leaning into what you're saying because there's so much. How do we get more of you? How do we get more of Eric's knowledge on speaking if we're wanting to jump further into it and delve more deeply into it?
You could go to speakernation.com. You could follow me on Instagram. I manage my own Instagram, and I speak quite a lot there about messaging and that sort of stuff. And I think Speaker Nation's got an Instagram account. So I think all of those are good options.
And you have a podcast. I'm not sure if it's still running, but it's
called we have a podcast. It's called Unforgettable. We have a book coming next year that's also called Unforgettable on that same thing. So that's the Speaker Nation podcast. And I have a new podcast as well coming shortly called A Wilder Life, which isn't so much about speaking. It's more about evolutionary mismatch and how to make life better. But there will be those topics will be in there as well.
Yeah, so fascinating. So many tips. Now, my last question is based on the title of the podcast. What is something that you once heard, Eric, that you could not unhear?
if you don't lie, you don't have to remember what you said. I really like that a lot. It's like, if you don't lie, and I think as a speaker, I think it's always been important, but it's become more important because these days everything's being recorded. And, maybe 10 years ago, you could get away with that garbage, and you shouldn't have, but you could have. Now you really can't. A very good friend of mine, Topher Morrison, he's one of the best speaker trainers in the world. He's an outstanding speaker himself and a good man. And he was training a guy, I won't name the guy, but he was training a guy and taught the guy, how to be a great speaker, coach, and so on. And the guy went out and launched a career, and he actually got quite prominent. He was speaking, all over America, Australia, Britain. He was doing quite well, but he would tell stories. He would tell Topher stories as if they were his. And you can do that as long as you disclaim. You can say, okay, I'm going to tell you this story that my trainer Topher told me, and I'm going to tell it to you like it happened to me, so it feels more real, but it didn't happen to me. No, that's not what he did. He was telling the stories as though they were his. And as I understand the story, he got invited to do a TED Talk. So he's on stage delivering the talk. And he starts telling one of these stories about how he was in the outback, and he was, I don't know, he's somewhere in Australia, and he was with some Aboriginal people, and they were doing, tribal stuff. And it was all fiction. It was all Topher's stories. It was all Topher's reality, not his. And then suddenly he looks in the audience, and there's Topher sitting in the audience, and he turns green, apparently, as I heard the story. And, I guess the moral really is, it's never a good idea to lie anyway, but it's even worse these days. It's just not worth it. Just be yourself.
I love that. Thank you so much, Eric. Everything you shared today is so fascinating, and I think very helpful. It certainly helped me in my path to becoming a more confident speaker. So I know that this is going to help many others along the path as well. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the show. What did you think? And what did you feel? Let us know by leaving me a message on the Things You Can't Unhear Instagram community page. And if you can, give us some ratings love on your favorite listening platform.